Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into The Illusion of Freedom, Escaping Wage Slavery, an article that puts forth a really provocative idea, that our modern labor systems, despite all appearances of offering us freedom, actually ensnare individuals in what it starkly calls wage slavery.
A challenging concept, definitely.
Absolutely. And so our central question for this discussion is this. Does the modern labor system accurately constitute wage slavery, as described in the article? And following from that, do the proposed small steps truly offer a path to genuine freedom, or are they maybe just individual adaptations within a system that fundamentally remains, well, unyielding?
Okay, that's the core tension.
Right. So, I'll be arguing that the article presents a frankly compelling case for how modern work does align with its definition of wage slavery, making the suggested small steps actually crucial acts of resistance and liberation.
And I'll be taking the other side, suggesting that wage slavery might be an overstatement of our current condition, and that the solutions offered, while perhaps useful, lean more towards personal optimization rather than genuine systemic liberation.
Okay, let's get into it then. The article, it builds its case for wage slavery by drawing this really sharp distinction between what it sees as truly meaningful work, things like gardening, crafting, maybe pursuing a passion, and the soul-draining labor of many modern office jobs. It paints this picture, doesn't it? Endless meetings, rigid schedules, and fluorescent-lit monotony. It argues the frustration isn't with work itself, but with a system where our very survival forces us to sell our time. And there's this historical piece too, tracing how work shifted from being task-oriented, think artisans, farmers, often working apparently fewer than 20 hours a week, to the time-oriented model that came with the Industrial Revolution. That shift, the article asserts, gave us the 40-hour work week, not really for balance, but for, well, maximum productivity. Society, it argues, keeps pushing this myth of freedom, this idea that if you just work hard, you'll get free. But the reality it describes is quite different. School trains obedience, college creates debt, careers bind us to bills. It calls it a trap, dressed up as opportunity. So for the author, wage slavery boils down to this obligation to sell time just to survive, where corporations don't seem particularly bothered about our well-being. And that Gallup stat really hits home, 60% of workers feeling emotionally detached. Consumerism just makes it all worse, right? Pushing us to constantly chase bigger houses, better cars, newer tech, fueling this cycle of work, spend, debt, more work, which, from the article's perspective, fundamentally undermines any real freedom.
Right. That's a very thorough summary of the article's main thrust. And look, it undeniably raises some really important critiques about modern work culture. I won't argue with that. But I do find the term wage slavery itself, well, problematic. And perhaps, as you initially framed it, an overstatement of our contemporary labor condition. The author does clarify, as you noted, that it isn't about literal chains, but an obligation to sell time. Now, that distinction for me is absolutely critical, because modern workers, generally speaking, possess far greater agency, mobility, and choice than, say, historical serfs or indentured servants or certainly actual slaves. The whole myth of freedom argument, while it definitely highlights real societal pressures, it also seems to overlook the genuine opportunities that careers can offer, for skill development, for social advancement, even for personal fulfillment.
This rebellion through small steps, things like building skills, coding, writing, whatever. Or saving money to buy back time, which is an interesting phrase.
Buy back time. Right. Accumulating resources to lessen reliance on the wage. These sound less like, radical acts of rebellion against some total system of control, and more like pretty pragmatic, individual strategies for navigating the existing economic landscape. I mean, they're sensible things to do. And interestingly, the article itself even mentions systemic alternatives like shorter work weeks or universal basic income, which kind of suggests, doesn't it, that these individual small steps might not on their own really be enough to fundamentally alter the structure it's labeling wage slavery.
I appreciate you highlighting that distinction the author makes, that it's not literal chains. I do, but I still believe the term wage slavery is powerful because it captures the, let's say, insidious nature of the systemic control. It's less visible, maybe, but it's about being compelled to sell your time just to survive. And that historical shift you mentioned, from task-oriented work where an artisan might work until the job is done, to this time-oriented model designed for maximum productivity, where your value is tied to being present for 8 hours regardless of output. That created a fundamental bind, I think, that still affects us deeply. The article draws a parallel, doesn't it, between ancient systems where labor mostly enriched the elite and modern corporate structures? And that feeds right into what the author calls the zombie feeling, that emotional detachment the Gallup poll found in 60% of workers.
So it's not about physical chains, sure, but it's about the systemic compulsion, this cycle that seems to benefit a relative few at the expense of many people's well-being and a sense of genuine freedom. It leaves a lot of people feeling like they lack real choice in their day-to-day lives.
I see the connection you're drawing to that zombie feeling. And the critique of dehumanizing work is, well, certainly valid. Many people feel that, no doubt. However, framing it specifically as wage slavery still feels like it risks obscuring the really significant differences from, say, chattel slavery, or even historical indentured servitude, where individuals had almost zero legal recourse, zero ability to just leave. Today, we have legal protections for workers, we have social safety nets. Okay, they might be imperfect, I grant you, but critically, we have the capacity for job mobility, for skill acquisition. Individuals generally retain a level of autonomy that simply didn't exist in those historical contexts you mentioned. So the question becomes, can we really call the obligation to sell time for survival slavery if there are diverse opportunities, however unevenly distributed, and if, as the article itself seems to suggest, one can eventually choose how to live on your own terms through conscious decisions and these small steps? It almost feels like we're flattening a very wide spectrum of unfreedom, maybe, instead of highlighting the distinct kinds of constraints we face today. While the pressures are real, equating them with the total lack of agency feels like a step too far for me.
I understand the concern about flattening that spectrum. That's a fair point. But I think the article is trying to shine a light specifically on the degree of compulsion, the subtle, pervasive economic pressure that can feel almost inescapable for many, even without those literal chains. Okay, so let's maybe pivot slightly then. If we accept, just for the sake of argument, this idea of systemic pressure, what about the solutions proposed? These small steps. I'd argue they are potent acts of rebellion, not just, coping mechanisms. They empower individuals to actively resist this perceived cycle of control. How? By building independent skills, coding, freelancing, writing, as you mentioned, by consciously saving money specifically to buy back time, and by deliberately reframing work as just a transaction, nothing more. This feels like a direct challenge to the consumerist tribe and that relentless societal pressure to keep up. It actually reminds me of that Albert Camus quote, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. For the article, these steps are precisely about that, choosing how to live on your own terms, even when the system tries to dictate those terms.
That's certainly a powerful philosophical framing, bringing in Camus. And look, I absolutely agree that those small steps, learning skills, saving money, getting control of your finances are incredibly beneficial. For personal well-being, for financial resilience, absolutely. They definitely enhance personal agency within the existing economic framework. I'd encourage anyone to do them. However, labeling them rebellion against wage slavery, that still feels to me like an overstatement. If the core problem is systemic wage slavery, as the article claims, then these individual acts, while admirable and undoubtedly helpful for the individuals involved, might just be helping people cope better with the chains,
rather than actually breaking them or dismantling the system itself. For instance, if you learn coding skills, you might just end up getting a better paying job, but still within that same system the article criticizes, right?
Or you might freelance but still be operating within the existing market dynamics. These seem more like strategies for personal optimization, for navigating the current reality more effectively. Do they fundamentally challenge the underlying power structures the article identifies as the problem? That's the question. What would real systemic liberation look like if these are just individual adaptations?
That is a fair challenge. What constitutes true systemic change versus adaptation? But the article seems to suggest that these individual acts, especially if adopted more widely, can start to chip away at the system's hold. And this leads us directly to, I think, a really crucial element here, the role of consumerism. I believe the article positions consumerism not just as some side effect, but as a critical mechanism of this wage slavery. It argues it actively traps individuals in that relentless cycle: work, spend, debt, more work. The constant pursuit of, bigger houses, better cars, newer tech, often driven by social pressure by trying to keep up. The article suggests this isn't always genuine desire, but often a kind of manufactured need. And this manufactured desire then compels the continuous labor needed to fund it. That question the article poses is quite pointed. What if we spent less and redefined success as having more time instead of more things? It really highlights how deeply consumerism, in this view, obstructs true freedom by pushing us to work more for things that might not even bring lasting fulfillment. It's presented as a subtle but very powerful form of control.
I understand the argument that consumerism can be a trap, and certainly our society bombards us with messages encouraging spending. We can probably all relate to that feeling, right? Chasing the next upgrade, feeling pressure to have certain things. However, I'm just not fully convinced it's always this inescapable cycle of control, or that every single purchase stems from a manufactured need. While yes, excessive consumerism can absolutely create financial burdens and contribute to feeling trapped, I think it's vital we consider individual choice and motivation here. Is the pursuit of goods always a forced march dictated by the system, or does it often reflect, genuine personal preferences and aspirations? People often choose to work hard to afford things and experiences they genuinely value. Maybe it's travel, education for their kids, supporting a hobby, or yes, even a bigger house if that's truly what they want. The article itself, interestingly, proposes redefining success as an individual act. Doesn't that strongly imply that individuals can and indeed do exert control over their consumption habits? It suggests agency, choice, not absolute subjugation to some manufactured cycle. So while consumerism definitely creates pressures, I'm hesitant to frame it as the kind of inescapable systemic control mechanism you're suggesting it is.
I see your point about individual agency within consumption, and it's certainly true that not every purchase feels coerced. However, the article, I think, is suggesting this pervasive, almost unconscious systemic influence that guides those choices, often perhaps to the detriment of our time and our autonomy. It speaks to how our very aspirations might be shaped by forces beyond just pure individual preference, subtly nudging us towards that work-spend-debt loop. So wrapping up my perspective, the concept of wage slavery, as explored in this source material, I find it powerfully illuminates the inherent constraints, the societal pressures embedded within our modern labor system. It forces us to confront how that basic obligation, selling one's time just to survive, especially when amplified by consumerism, creates a condition that for many feels significantly removed from genuine freedom. And the small steps in this light aren't just coping tools. They are framed as these essential acts of conscious choice, of personal rebellion, offering individuals a pathway to try and reclaim agency and define freedom on their own terms, even within this complex reality.
And from my side, while the article offers, as I said, a valuable and often incisive critique of the potentially alienating parts of modern work and those pervasive pressures of consumerism, this specific term wage slavery itself, I believe, demands very careful consideration. It risks perhaps oversimplifying what is a really nuanced relationship between individuals and incredibly complex economic systems. it might potentially overlook the real degrees of choice, of opportunity that do exist, however imperfectly distributed they might be within our current framework. I think this discussion has really brought out that enduring tension, hasn't it, between viewing our economic lives through a lens of systemic analysis versus focusing on individual agency, and ultimately understanding both perspectives, how systems shape us and how much individual choice we truly possess within them is absolutely crucial for any meaningful pursuit of freedom.
There is clearly much more to explore within this fascinating material regarding the nature of work, the meaning of liberation, and the difficult balance we all try to strike between individual aspiration and these larger societal structures.